Hello, my name is Dave Kleppinger. I'm a master gardener with the James City County Williamsburg unit associated with the Virginia Cooperative Extension, and I'm going to present PowerPoint presentation on soils. So just a program overview, just to talk about some of the things that I'll be talking about today. Master gardeners, I think, can serve our clients and serve ourselves better the more we understand soils. It's such an integral part to the growing experience. I'm going to talk about how soils are dynamic, how they're not equal. I'm going to be talking about some of the best ways of managing our soils for healthy soils and some of the tools we can use to understand soils. So when I became a master gardener in 2016, there was great emphasis placed upon us that we were no longer allowed to call soil dirt. Um, it Because dirt has a bad connotation. Old as dirt, you're a dirt bag, dirt poor. We've all heard these things, and they're all negative, and they in no way show any appreciation or understanding of how dynamic the soil environment is. It's an amazing place. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we find in soil. It's not all mineral matter. There's lots of little creatures in there that you can always see with a magnifying glass, with a telescope to not a telescope, with a magnifying glass. You have to magnify to see them. So in 1 teaspoon of soil, there can be up to 1 billion bacteria. There can be several thousand protozoa, and they all serve a function in support of plant growth. Several yards of fungal filaments. We'll talk about microchizae, fungi as I go through this show, and nematodes. All nematodes aren't bad. There are a lot of nematodes in the ground that are serving very beneficial purpose. So what's most important to understand is that there's a symbiotic relationship that's mutually beneficial between these microorganisms and the plant itself. The plant is absorbing sun and sunlight and water and carbon dioxide, and it produces carbohydrates and sugars that the soil organisms consume, and they in turn then convert that into nutrients that promote healthy plant growth. So, fun facts, just to amaze you, to magnify the significance of microorganisms in the soil. And this is from a Department of Agriculture publication. That earthy smell we would smell when fields are being plowed, we think it's soil. It's actually, they actually believe it's results from the chemicals that's produced by the microorganisms in the soil. 1 cup of soil can hold as many bacteria as there are people on Earth. It makes you feel like you got to wear gloves when you work in the soil once you start thinking about these types of things. That the weight of the bacteria in 1 acre of soil could equal the weight of a cow or two. And the next point is very important. A teaspoon of farm soil may contain tens of yards of fungi, but the same amount of undisturbed forest soil may hold 10 miles of fungi. Keep that thought in mind. There's a direct correlation between how frequently and extensively soil is disturbed and the amount of microorganisms that support plant growth that are in the ground. Lots of nematodes, earthworms, they serve a function other than just being something you use to bait fish. But they move soil from the lower levels of the ground up to the surface. And in a 10 to 20 year period, you can see they can turn over the top 6 inches of soil. The next point on the tips of plant roots is not so much soil related, but it's plant related. It's just the magnitude of how much root matter is in the ground associated with, for example, a mature tree. 5 million active root tips, all sort of screw-like motion into the soil. And we'll talk about how the mycorrhizae fungi attach themselves to those root tips. And perhaps the most significant I've saved for last, which I just found to be amazing, that we walk on the ground and it feels hard, but there's air moving in and out, and so much air in non-compacted soils in the upper 8 inches that it will completely renew itself in an hour. Just a staggering statistic. We're going to talk more about that as we move forward. So all soil is not created equal. So the picture on the left is a current picture of the first house that I ever bought, 1977, on a 40 by 100-foot lot outside Trenton, New Jersey. And the owners of that house both died in the house. They lived there over 50 years. And when I bought it, there were no trees and I wanted instant shade. And so I went to a nursery, and on the picture on the right, the tall tree, I told them I wanted an October glory maple and I wanted a big tree. And they said, if you can dig a hole 4 feet deep and 4 feet square, we will come and we'll place the tree in the hole and get it staked up for you. And I said, okay, I'll do that. And so I dug 4 feet down, 4 feet square, nothing but beautiful topsoil. That is not something that I've ever found anywhere I've lived in Virginia. All soil is not created equal. And that's why New Jersey is the Garden State. Campbell's Soup, its first and original location was in Camden, New Jersey, South Jersey, just across the river from Delaware, just across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. The picture on the right is from the 1930s, and it shows women who live in Philadelphia who would commute to the farms of Camden County to pick carrots, which would all be destined for the Campbell's Soup plant in Camden. And of course, New Jersey is famous for its tomatoes, and not just its tomatoes, but its peaches and its corn and its blueberries and its cranberries. There's a very good reason why it's called the Garden State. Wonderful soils. So my original experience as a professional, I have a master's degree in city and regional planning. I'm not an agronomist. I'm not a soil scientist. I'm not a biologist. This is not going to be a biology lesson. I'm not going to pretend that I'm an agronomist, but I am a land planner, and I did a lot of environmental planning early in my career. And it was on the very beginnings of environmental planning that was in the environmental movement that was occurring in this country. And I was working for a consulting firm while I was in graduate school and after graduate school. And we grabbed a hold of soil surveys because the soil surveys provided lots of information that differentiated soil. Was the soil prime agricultural, as this exhibit shows? Did it have high water table? Was it highly erodible? There's just all different ways in which the soil survey describes each of the different mapping units, different soil mapping units, and we could map those out across the community in order to help governments make good policy decisions. And you can use the soil surveys also to at a local level, which is what I do now when I do visits to homeowners. I had the fortunate experience when I moved to Virginia in 1980 uh, to to meet Bob Hodges, and Bob was the doing the soil survey for James City, York County, and Williamsburg. And what that meant was that Bob was using a 4-foot auger and walking around the countryside, digging 4-foot auger holes and looking those over and mapping soils. Because we're in the coastal plain, he was using topographic maps because the soils in the coastal plain were laid by water. The coastal plain was underwater, and depending upon what material was eroding off of the Appalachian Mountains at any particular time, uh, for example, if you're at 40 feet above sea level and a nearby area is 40 feet above sea level, there's a good chance that you're going to see the same soil mapping units in those locations. But my father had died in 1980, and I met Bob in 1980, and he reminded me so much of my father. He he had 7 kids. My father had 6 kids, uh, and I had a fascination with soils and experience with soil surveys. And I think Bob wasn't accustomed to people like being really interested in the kind of stuff that he did. And so I would hang out with him. He would take me out and show me how he did his mapping. Whenever he found interesting or unique soils, he would uh, he would come over and say, "Hey, you got to come out with me. I want to show you these soils." It was a wonderful experience for me. When Bob finished the James City, York, and Williamsburg soil survey, he did New Kent. I just happened to move and was working in New Kent. And then he did Charles City County, and I just happened to be in Charles City. So over a period of about 16 years, I enjoyed a relationship with Bob that was very beneficial to me as a professional and as an individual. In 1996, I moved away to Lexington, Virginia, and for work, and retired back to Williamsburg in 2014. And when I came back, I found out Bob had Alzheimer's, so I wasn't able to renew that relationship. But he's buried at Williamsburg Memorial Park, and I know Bob and I would have laughed when he was going out looking for where his cemetery plot would be, because he chose to be buried in Kempsville Emporia soils, which is a great soil, and that would have been just I know he looked. He had to have looked at what the soil was, and that would have been a great laugh. A fine man. One interesting thing that Bob told me was that the soils in our area are predominantly very sandy in the upper horizons, the layers that are closest to the ground, the growing medium. And even though you hear a lot of people talk about their clay soils, for the most part, you don't see a lot of clays and soils unless you get down at least a foot below the surface. There is one area that's uniquely different than that, and that is I'm standing right now at on Route 5, John Tyler Highway at Centerville Road, and I'm looking up Centerville Road north towards Green Spring, which would be up to the top here. And Bob told me this is an escarpment. This rise here is an escarpment. It's an old shoreline. Uh, and so down here would have been underwater at a time when this was not. And this part of James City County, First Colony, St. George's 100, Fieldcrest, Berkeley's Green, that area is not so sandy in the upper levels. It's got a lot of clays closer to the surface. And I've done soil studies there for people. Um, One individual that I did it for said, who's a master gardener, said if they knew that this was the soil that was there when they bought the property, they would not have bought the property. It's a little more difficult to work with these soils just because they're not as loamy. There's just a lot more clay. There's high water table. Clays can be somewhat tight. Um, so that's a unique section of our work area as master gardeners here in Williamsburg, James City. That's different than most other areas where you find predominantly sands in the upper horizons. One very distinct and impressive thing that James City County has done, you can go on their GIS system, property.jamescitycountyva.gov, and go into property records, but their property records include maps. And you can open up the map and you have all different options for what you just click on whatever you want to see. So when I do a soil study for people, I not only do soils, but I click resource protection area so we can see areas that have been identified as warranting protection to preserve and protect the waters of the Chesapeake Bay. And then I also do contours. It's helpful to see what the drainage patterns are, to understand water flows across the property, potential areas where there could be erosion issues. Uh, for this purpose is just so the map's not complicated. I'm just showing soils. And so on the map on the right, those brown lines that you see coursing through there are different soil mapping unit areas. And the highlighted yellow area, which is 106 Aberdeen, is where I live. And I'm going to zoom in there so you can see what the soil is on that property. And it's 15E. The property that's to the left at 100 is 18B, which is a prime agricultural soil. Mine is not prime agricultural, primarily because it's sloped. It has a 15 to 25% slope. So 15E, what do you do then? Well, there's the 15E. So these are the mapping units that Bob Hodges identified. One other thing about when they identified it, it just wasn't Bob. It was a big team effort. I can remember walking into his office and laying on the floor would be like a dozen 4-foot lengths of soil that had come out of the auger that he hand augered. And there'd be a team of agronomists looking at those, making decisions, and they do chemical analysis in labs as well. But looking at the horizon of the soil, the profile of it, that 4-foot profile, to make some preliminary decisions about what mapping units they would fall into. So we have 38 different mapping units. My property is Emporia Complex, 15 to 25% slope. It's designated as 15E on the map. The 25 just to the right of it is the page number that you would find it in the soil survey report, which I'm going to go to in just a second. You see through this list, though, you see lots of sandy loams, lots of sandies. You don't see much clay. And when you do see clays like Levy, silty clay, number 21, Johnson complex is another one. Those tend to be found in wetlanded areas. And Emporia is an interesting one, and I wanted to use Emporia. Emporia, about 20% of the soils in the Williamsburg, James City County are Emporia. So I see that quite frequently when I'm doing soil studies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Emporia soils as I move forward. Not only because it's an interesting soil, but just to show you the kind of information that's in the soil survey report itself. So this is the introductory paragraph to the Emporia soils. And one of the interesting things about that is that it's formed over layers of fossil shells. And when I built a house in New Kent County 40 years ago, and I had a well bored, a water well bored 68 feet down, and they pulled up all these shells. And it was just such an experience to see all these prehistoric shells from when the area was underwater. Anyway, you can find shells in Emporia in the upper horizons. Emporia is one of the oldest soils in the survey area. So the picture on the left is you see an eroded out area at the toe of that slope. And I took this picture walking from the 8th green of Marshhawk, one of the golf courses in Ford's Colony, to the 9th tee box. And sure enough, you can see the shells that are in that soil at that slope. So I thought, well, that's interesting. As you can see in this picture, there's no erosion above that point. There's significant erosion where the shells have been exposed at the toe of that slope. So why is that? Well, the soil survey actually gives you an answer for that. And um, so you see one of the other parts of the description of the Emporia soils. It's got a it's restricted by a firm compacted layer at a depth of 37 inches. So 37 inches in the below the ground surface, and it could be 3 or 4 feet, depending on lots of, how much disturbance there's been in above the surface. It has what they call a perched water table. So if when rain comes, whoops, whoops, whoops. When it rains, the rainwater wants to go down straight into the ground. And so from where those trees are, it would go straight down. And eventually, in time, it would get to the groundwater, which is sort of the gray blue area all the way at the bottom. But this is showing a localized aquilitude, which is sort of a crusty layer of soil, a lot of sands and clays that just crusted and is so dense that the water can't pass through. So what happens when you have a perched water table is the water gets just above that aquilitude. It can't go sideways. It can't go straight down. It goes sideways. And when it goes sideways, it presents itself on that side slope in the form of a spring or a weep. And so that picture that I showed of the erosion at the toe of that slope, that's this water coming from above the perch, presenting itself at the toe of that slope. And there must have been a very heavy rain, and it just all the water went sideways and has created an erosion issue. So I have an aquilitude on my property, and the water goes sideways. My neighbor just below me has a spring, and almost all year long he has water weeping out of the ground in his property to the point where he can't even cut it. It's so wet, and so he's put stone around it, and it's just to protect it and cover it. But so the rainwater that's falling on my property is going sideways, and it's presenting itself in the form of a little spring on his property. So the Emporia soils are low in organic matter content and natural fertility. I will say, unless it's a soil that's at the bottom of a creek, all soils in our area are low in organic matter and natural fertility. It's one of the reasons why we put compost. We apply compost in our gardens. We should be applying it to our lawns as well. So when I do have a soil test done, I spend the extra $4 to have the organic matter tested. You can see in the lower right-hand corner that on this particular test, it was 2.4%. And that's what I typically find is soils between 2.5 and 3.5% is what I typically find as organic matter content. What's typically recommended as ideal would be 5%. So this is ideal soil composition. It's about 50% solids and 50% pores. And of the pore space, about half of it is air and half of it is water. When soil becomes compacted, you end up with far more solids than you do with pore space. And in the pore space, it's predominantly water. An anaerobic circumstance, there's not a lot of air getting to the roots. This is when plants are more likely to experience root rot because there's just not a lot of airflow in the ground. It's the roots are always sitting in in watered soil. All right, that was compacted, and then no. All right, let me move into soil texture analysis. So this is what they call a jar test. If you're just curious about what kind of soil that you have, you can do a soil texture analysis with a jar test. This is just a peanut butter jar. You can use a mason jar. Mason might be a little more exact because it doesn't indent at the bottom as much as this peanut butter jar does. But if you go out into an area that you're curious, let's say a garden bed, you go out there and get what you consider a representative sampling of the soil there to a depth of no more than 4 to 6 inches, and put it in a jar. You can screen it to take out mulch and grass, um, and then you fill the jar up to about 2/3 of the way with water, and then you agitate it. You shake it, shake it, shake it. You can put a teaspoon of dishwashing detergent in there as well. Shake it, shake it, shake it, and then sit it up and let it stand. If you come back in 2 minutes, 2 minutes, you'll see that sand layer will already be at the bottom. The sands are the biggest soil particles, they're the heaviest, they go right to the bottom, and you mark it with a black line where the sand is. Then you come back in 2 hours, and the silt will have settled out above the sand, but below the clays. And then you would draw a line at the silt, top of the silt line. You come back in 2 days, and the clay, the smallest particles, will have settled out, and then you do a black line above the clay. Anything above that, and there's not much here, you can see the black residue on the bottom. That would be organic matter that's in the soil. Now, when I did my Emporia soils and went through this, I had no clay. There was no clay in the top 4 to 6 inches of my soil. And I thought, well, this isn't going to uh, present what I want you all to see. I want you to see all three of the components that make up soil. And so I had a sample that I had taken in Colonial Heritage. And a lot of the development in Colonial Heritage, they're using heavy earth moving equipment, and they're mixing the upper layer soils with the lower level soils. And so I see lots of clay in the close to the ground in Colonial Heritage. Anyway, this is a soil that I collected from Colonial Heritage. So the next thing you do is you measure the height of all the material. So in this case, it was 4.75 inches from the bottom of the jar to the top of the clay, and then you measure the length of each of these soil segments, the length of the sand, the length of the silt, and the height of the sand, height of the silt, height of the clay, and it does require a little math, uh, and it's just a percent. So of that, 1.75 inches of the total 4.75 inches was sand. 37% of that soil sample was sand. 21% was silt. 42% was clay. And you go to a soil texture triangle, and you plot those percentages on there to see how your soil would be described. So looking at the clay, which was 42%, I go up that side angle on the left to 42, and I've drawn a blue line straight across. You go to the silt, which was 21%. I go find 21% on that side, and I draw a line 21%. And then the sand was 37%, and I draw a red line up there. And where they meet indicates that would be considered a clay soil. The clay is so predominant, and obviously it's 42%, it's the most predominant. Obviously, loam is the sweet spot. And loam can be a silty loam, which is on the, um, or you could have a sandy loam, a sandy clay loam. Uh, there's a lot of different loams, but by and large, this is how loams work out. And you, depending on whether the clay is 7% or 27%, will determine whether it's a clay loam or it's a sand loam or whatever. But this is sort of the sweet spot being in this. You get the best of each of the component parts that make up soil. This is Emporia soils are commonly very strongly acidic or strongly acidic. All soils in Virginia are acidic soils. On the eastern seaboard, acidic soils is the predominant soil that you're going to find. And so strongly to very strongly, and this is what I typically find for soils that have not been in, where lime has not been applied, the naturally occurring pH is generally in the 5s. Why is this important to know? People use lime in order to increase or decrease the acid nature of the soil, to neutralize soil acidity. Why is that important? If you're applying fertilizer in soil with a pH that's less than 6, those nutrients, those macro and micro essential nutrients, are less able to dissolve when the pH is in the acid range. And so as a result, your plant is not able to absorb those nutrients. And so we typically have to, for many plants, have to apply lime to move the soil into a pH range of 6 to 7.5, where they can absorb naturally occurring and applied nutrients. So this is very typical of what I find, 5.3. And then when we send the soils off to Virginia Tech, they'll develop a fertilizer and limestone recommendation. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So my son bought a house in First Colony, and his pH was low, 5.3. Organic matter was low. This is not his, but it's similar to his. And all his nutrient levels were high. And so that told me that whoever was selling the house, and the lawn looked pretty bad. It did not have good density. That told me that the homeowner had bought some fertilizer and just thrown it out. And so when I went in and test, I'm getting high values here, but the turf can't improve because that fertilizer can't be absorbed by the turf because the pH is too low. It needs to be in that 6 to 7.5 range in order for the plant to be able to absorb these nutrients that it requires to survive. This is another table that I include when I do a soil study for a homeowner that shows the macro and the micronutrients. You can see those bars laying horizontally on this chart. Soil pH running along the bottom. So what this is indicating is you can see where it's green, where you get highest number of important bars that are green is in that 6 to 7.5 range, right in the center of the table. And as the pH drops, you can see particularly the macronutrients, the most important ones at the top. Those bars yellow and then red out, and they're thinning out. And it's just a visual depiction that demonstrating that if your pH is too low, any naturally occurring or applied nutrients are very difficult for the plants to absorb. So as a result, lime is applied. Ideally, lime is applied after a soil test is done, so it can be precisely applied and not over applied. If you apply too much lime, and your pH ends up turning into 8 to 8.5, you can see the bars once again are narrowing out, turning red, and the plant is no better off. And you're just putting down excessive product that's not beneficial to anybody, particularly the environment. I do want to talk about native. Um, I when I meet with a homeowner who has awful looking lawn and it's next to the woods, and I'll point out the oak trees and that are tall, majestic, and doing fine, and I'll just sort of ask the rhetorical question, why do you think those oak trees are doing so well and your turf is doing miserably? And the answer is, well, the oaks are native. In fact, what's truly believed to be native on the Virginia Peninsula, they believed that before there was any human settlement here, that that other than in wetlanded areas, marshy areas, that the upland areas would have been forested, would have been oaks and hickories, pines, uh, holly understory trees. Um, those were the true natives in our area. Some of the things that we might think are native are not native. Corn, we might think is native because when English settlers came here, the indigenous population had corn, but it was not native to the peninsula. But over time, it found its way up here from Mexico. I provide other examples here as well. Things may not be native, they naturalize well. Um, but we do need oftentimes to apply what we call inputs, fertilizers, lime. We don't never have to do those with the oak trees that are in the forest. They're truly native, and the growing conditions are ideal for them. So when I meet with a homeowner on their turf, I sort of go through the process of talking about why turf requires so much in the way of inputs. So tall fescue is not a native plant. It's native in Northern Europe, and I'm sure that the pH in Northern Europe is probably in that more neutral 7 zone. Zoysia grass comes from Asia. Bermuda grass, I like to ask the question, and people think it's Bermuda, and maybe it did start in did come here to North America from Bermuda. It actually originates in Africa. It's one of the reasons why we call it wiregrass. It's just such an aggressive growing grass, the kind of thing that you would associate with growing uh, in the heart of Africa. They believe Bermuda grass came over, that it was just seeds in the hay in ships that were transporting uh, slaves to the Western Hemisphere, and people saw its potential as a turf grass, and that's why we have it. So, as master gardeners, we have some responsibility to make sure property owners are using products wisely. And one of the reasons why I started doing working with homeowners on turf was having the experience of going into a big box or into Ace and just seeing all the different products on the shelf and thinking, what do I use? Which one's right? And the stores, they sell things all through the year, and some of these products, there are certain times of the year you apply them. Other times you apply them, it's bad. Uh, if you can't, you got to read the label. If you don't read the label and you just figure more is better, more is usually never better. In fact, we don't probably, we use a lot more product than we really need to use. Um, so here's a homeowner in Colonial Heritage that uh, put fertilizer out, did not have a soil test, just thought the more they put down, the better, and it just burnt the grass up. So it passed by, and I think probably everybody may have missed it, but December 5th was World Soil Day. I'm sure many people didn't even know we celebrated World Soil Day. Um, but it's important, and it's important in Virginia. Virginia has a Virginia Soil Health Coalition, and part of that is to help educate its citizens about the values of soil and how to best take care of soil. And Virginia Master Gardeners are a part of that collaboration, and which is one of the reasons why I'm doing this program. So, four core principles to feed and protect soil. I'm going to go through each one of them individually. One, keep the soil covered. There's lots of reasons to keep soil covered. Uh, some of the obvious ones: prevent erosion, slow rainfall, so that rain can infiltrate straight down and not run off, and buffer soil temperature. So you want to buffer soil temperature. You don't want the soil to get too hot. You don't want the soil to get too cold. Not only are you protecting the plant roots, you're protecting the microorganisms that are in the ground in that symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationship that they have with the plants. So I put this up and always ask the question, what's going on here with the turf? So this is Ford's Colony, and Ford's Colony has a very ambitious program to make sure that all its soil is covered. It uses Bermuda grass, which is the tan grass that you see here, because it requires less inputs and sustains itself well through the summer. In the winter, the vegetation above the ground dies and turns tan, but the roots are still alive and they're still holding soil. But the only thing that really where Bermuda grass will not grow is in the shade. And so that's why you have this green patch right here, which is a cool season grass, probably some sort of fescue bluegrass mix that does well in the shade. This also tells you which direction is north. The shady side of the tree, where the Bermuda grass will not grow, has been planted in the fescue bluegrass mix. And in that way, they have good soil coverage of all the turf through the community. So this is my yard. A picture on the right, I've used stone, I've used mulch, I've used plant material to provide cover. And on the left, I have areas of my yard where I just leave the leaves, which is a great way. That's what Mother Nature had intended. In the front of my property where the vehicles would ride over the grass, it's now covered in stone to hold the soil in place to prevent it from eroding. I have lawn area, even despite the fact that some people consider me to be the lawn guy. I only have about 1,100 square feet of grass, and I also have, and all that is right along the strip along the road. I have mulch and low-lying juniper ground covers through my property. And I've planted about of that 1,100 square feet of my lawn. I have about 150 square feet in clover that I'm experimenting. This is white clover. This is a clover lawn in the Richmond Hill subdivision off South Henry Street in Williamsburg. And that front yard is entirely clover. The neat thing about, well, it's just wonderful. It's a wonderful ground cover. Uh, it's not ideal in full sun, but this, I mean, it used to be by grass seeds in the 60s. It always had clover because it fixes nitrogen in place. Um, but in the spring, when the flowers are on there, the bees are all over it. You don't have to cut it with a lawnmower. It doesn't require any inputs. Maybe a little water if it gets dry in the summer. Uh, but it's a pretty cool ground cover to use. Now, the ground cover that would be native would be moss. And I have talked several property owners out of converting their yards that are mossy like this, who want to have like tall fescue lawns. I mean, you don't have to cut this. It's green through the year. It just won't grow anywhere. This is sort of a perfect storm here. You have acidic soils, they're shady, uh, it's moist. You have oak trees. It's just sort of a, a perfect environment for moss to grow. By the way, this is in Ford's Colony. This is someone's backyard in Ford's Colony. You never know where you're going to find something as beautiful as this in sometimes the least expected places. Whoops. Okay, minimize soil disturbance. As I became more and more familiar um, uh, with the academic aspects of soil, this is the one that's most meaningful to me. What we're finding is that the best thing to do is to disturb soil the least. So obviously, I think farmers are probably the first to clue in on this because they work so closely with extension services. But it used to be farmers would plow their fields once, twice a year. You never see open plowing anymore. When they're putting seed down, they're slit seeding. They're just cutting enough of a slit in the ground to just drop the seed. All the studies are showing that all those microorganisms in the ground, uh, when they're disrupted, uh, they're most impacted in a very negative way. I gave you a statistic earlier in this program about how the amount of microorganisms in the forest soils is so much greater than in a farm field. And that's the reason. Think of it like this. If your house was hit by a tornado, everything would go flying all over the place. It would be very disruptive. Things would have to be put back together. It would take a long time to do it. It wouldn't all come back the right way. And that's sort of what happens every time you disturb the ground. If you're going to go out and till your garden, you're going to be breaking up all the mycorrhizae fungi, all those filaments, all that networking that they've built over the years. You're disturbing it. You're knocking it back. You're exposing that soil to the sun. It's unhealthy for those microorganisms. And because the plant is so dependent on microorganisms uh, for its healthiness, you're doing a great disservice. So these days, what we should be telling our clients is don't disturb. Try to do the minimal amount of soil disturbance as possible. So you don't have to mix compost into the soil. I put it on top. I never put more than like a half an inch on a lawn, no more than like a quarter of an inch of compost in a garden every year, maybe twice a year. I'll just hand toss it out there. You don't want to put it on real thick, but it's absorbed into the soil and it feeds those microbes, which in turn then feed the plants. So this is colonial heritage. Obviously, these microorganisms are they're just pretty much being wiped out. Uh, Not only has the soil been exposed, it's been compacted, it's been seriously impacted. The productivity of the soil has been knocked back as well. And even, I'll go over there. I get a lot of calls to do. People have problems with their lawns, and the colonial heritage. They'll go, when they're going to do a whole street, they go through there and they sort of level the ground. They get the utility systems in place in the streets, and they're using heavy earth moving equipment. They get the homes built. The last thing they do is they put the sod out. It's nice and green. It looks great. the home is bought in 30 days. The next year, the grass isn't growing. The homeowners are contacting us to come out and do a turf law visit, and I can't get my probe in the ground because it's been compacted so hard. Well, if I can't get it in the ground, the roots aren't getting in the ground either, and the microbes are like non-existent to support plant life. And so it's a very unhealthy situation. Um, I'll tell you a story. Mr. Hodges worked with Shirley Plantation in the 1980s. Um, they had sand and gravel deposits uh, under a large area of their property, and they wanted to mine that out. Uh, but it was under prime agricultural farmland, and they wanted to be able to, um, once they mined the sand and gravel out, to be able to enjoy the same kind of crop yields that they were getting before they mined it out. And so nobody really thought that that was going to be possible. But what they did was they soil is laid in what they call horizons, at different levels. You'll see different coloration. It's different material. And what they did as carefully as they could, they tried to strip off each of those layers separately and stockpile them. And then once the sand and gravel was mined out, they reapplied those back in the same order that they had taken them off. And their productivity was just 40% of what it had been before they removed the soil. Now, part of that is just the whole issue of compacting and you just never get it back right. But the other part is all those microorganisms, they're gone. They're not there. That has to be reestablished. And they sell microhyzy that you can apply. Uh, that's not a short-term proposition. It's not like putting nitrogen fertilizer out on your lawn and it rains and your grass turns green. It's not lime. Lime can take 6 to 18 to 24 months to fully move your pH from 5.3 up to 6.8 in clay soils. The microhyzy fungi that could take years to build that whole network of filaments of hyphae that's necessary to support, extend the plant's ability to reach out and to get the nutrients that it needs to grow well. Maximize living roots. So that relationship between the plants and the microbes, when there are no living roots there, the microorganisms have nothing to associate with. They decline in popularity. They decline in number, and so that's why they rotate crops. That's why you always want to have living plants because it continues that symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationship through the year. So a little bit more about microhyzy fungi. Uh, the word itself, mic, microhyzy, means root fungus. What it does is, for most plants, the microhyzy fungi actually are absorbed by the roots and then extend from the roots and extend the roots well beyond the roots, delivering nutrients to that plant. We've heard stories about how the trees are talking to each other. They're enjoying this connectivity that the fungi and the other microorganisms in the ground permit it to have. But not all the microhyzy. Uh, there are lots of different microhyzy. They're still counting the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of beneficial microhyzy that support plants. Not all plants require them. The Brachiosaw, the family of plants that's broccoli and cauliflower and kale and cabbage, they have no association with mycorrhizae fungi. They don't require it. Uh, some mycorrhizae just coat the tips of the roots, coat the outside of the roots. That's a small minority, but it's the ones that support trees. Different mycorrhizae support different plants. There's not one that's good for everything. And as I said, it's not a short-term proposition. It takes years for them to really do their job. But the more plant material that's in the ground, the better able there is to also develop these microorganisms to support plant life. And energize with diversity. There are studies that say that having diverse selection of plants, you'll attract a wider variety and attract and support a wider variety of beneficial fungi in the ground. And some of the studies indicate that having native plants do best because that supports the indigenous microorganisms that are already present in this part of Virginia. And I'm going to conclude with this. Test soils before you do anything. Just don't assume, well, I need to throw some fertilizer out. I think we tend to over fertilize things. I see lots of soil tests, and there are a lot of naturally occurring nutrients in the ground that are sufficient to support plant life, particularly plants that are either, let's call them native, or that have naturalized well in this area over, let's say, hundreds of years. But when you have a soil test done, or you recommend to a client they have a soil test done, say we do a landscape love visit, this is a great opportunity to recommend a soil test. If they're going to, when you fill out the form, you'll see it has a plant code list. You can code what are you testing for. You collect the soil from the area where that you're anticipating putting a vegetable garden. If you've make sure at the bottom that you're checking routine soil and checking organic matter. I haven't found soluble salts to be an issue in this area, but I do strongly recommend that you get the organic matter tested. I think getting both those tested, I think it's $14. You take the box to the post office with the paperwork. They'll put it in a little box, send it off to Virginia Tech. It costs about $20 by the time you're all done with paying for the test and paying for the mailing. When it comes back from Virginia Tech, it'll provide you with a lime and fertilizer recommendation for whatever it is that you're planning on growing. So if you're meeting with a property owner that wants to do a vegetable garden, take them the paperwork and the box. I've actually taken the paperwork in the box and collected the soil for them, and then let them take it to the post office and mail it. And when they get the results back, when they fill out the paperwork, you can fill it out with their name and with your name so that you'll also get a copy of the results. So that when you get the results and they have the results, you can look at those results and you can communicate with them. Now, you may feel like, what do I know about this? Well, Virginia Tech has these nice explanatory sheets for how to read a soil test. And it's plenty sufficient information that you'll be able to answer any homeowner question about it. Not only just the soil test itself, but they also have test note sheets that are specific to homes and to shrubs and trees and for vegetable and flower gardens, so that you can feel confident that you'll be able to provide them with a level of service that perhaps you're not providing them right now, that's so basic, intrinsic, and nothing more important than making sure that the medium that they're growing their plants in is in as optimal condition as possible. And that's my presentation. I hope you found that beneficial. Thank you.